This is the Crucible, the JRTC Experience.
Hey, click to my position over.
This is where we discuss warfighting skills and lessons learned in a decisive action training environment for large-scale combat operations at JRTC.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Commander of Operations Group, Colonel Ricky Taylor, welcome to the Crucible podcast, the JRTC Experience. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tim Price, the Brigade Task Force Senior here at JRTC, and I'm excited today to welcome our Deputy Commander of Operations Group, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Ginty, to have a discussion on perhaps one of the most elusive and hated word in the MDMP process, wargaming. So Ian, if you would, give us a brief background introduction, please.
Okay, so I'm the Deputy Commander for JRTC Operations Group. My primary duties, whatever the COG doesn't want to do, that's what I do. But also, I touch a lot of sustainment, warfighting function here at JRTC, along with the Lima team. A lot of it is focused on the beginning and the end of the rotation for RSOI. Then filling gaps anywhere the command needs me to be during execution and outside of execution. I'll also role play occasionally as the O or the S in the 21st Airborne Division staff during some of our Cubs and other events. And then for my background, this is my fourth assignment to a combat training center, my third assignment to the Joint Readiness Training Center. I started in the 1st to 509th Airborne Infantry for 3.5 years, commanded in 2nd Cavalry, did my field grade time in 10th Mountain Division, and then commanded in 10th Mountain Division as a cavalry squadron commander. And this is my and your second year here at the Joint Readiness Training Center, and that's where we're at.
And Ian's being super humble. He's a wealth of information from a tactical and doctrinal perspective. And what I appreciate about him is he's a critical thinker, and not just accepting what we see here as results of imperfection or lack of understanding or lack of preparedness, but trying to get at the essence of why units are not at the level they need to be and how can we get them there. Which kind of leads to the topic of conversation today, which is the war game. And that word has an energy around it. When you say the war game, people usually run, rats scattering out of the tent trying to get away from it, because wargaming's hard, and it's an application of critical thinking in the MDMP process that we usually do when we're smoked. We usually do like in the middle of the night, and we don't apply the right talent and focus on what is perhaps the most important part of the military decision-making process. So I just want to open up with, from your perspective, in layman's terms, describe wargaming.
Okay, so for wargaming itself, so you want to hear about how we wargame or what wargaming should be?
What should it be?
What should it be? So the wargaming should be where we're synchronizing the plan, right? But that's easy to say but not to do. So it should be the entire staff, or as much of the staff as we can, getting together, fighting their warfighting functions through the plan. And to enable that, you've got to have a detailed enemy plan. You've got to have the right products that you need to execute. You've got to understand, every warfighting function has to understand their role and what their vulnerabilities and their capabilities are.
Yep.
And it's got to be led by the commander in most cases, because our field grades are great folks. They're learning their job too, but the commander's got the experience where they can sit there and help adjudicate red and blue and see the gaps between in the staff's plan and where those transition points are going to be, because the field grades are focused on process a lot of the time, but the commander, they're a little bit removed. They got the experience, and the sergeant major for that matter, they can see where all those gaps are and help the staff synchronize that plan.
Yeah, I think warfighting begins in the intelligence preparation of the environment. The reverse warfighting function analysis that takes place with the whole of staff to understand really the red plan, the MCOO, and the event temp, so we have something to base our plan against, right? Often we see directed COAs with a poor understanding of the enemy, which leads to that confirmation bias that what we're doing is actually the right thing. And I think that, again, because it's hard, because it requires a level of experience that not all the staff has. We kind of wish our way through it a lot of the times, and we see that the result of not doing it right is chaos, and it's a lack of understanding of what's happening, what's going to happen, and what the next transition looks like, because we didn't really take the time to go into the detail required. What do you see? You describe what it should look like. How do you describe what we see in practice?
Okay, so I'll be honest that when I was a field grade officer, I don't think I had a good understanding of what wargaming was supposed to do. And what I saw at MCTP and what I've seen here as well is frequently, we'll crush mission analysis. We'll generally break off our stovepipes of excellence and come back together. So we've done some mission analysis. We'll crush COA dev, and usually our planners, our maneuver planners, are not really helping with mission analysis so much, nor are developing courses of action, because they're not as concerned about the mission analysis piece, because that's a two-shot problem, they think. And then by the time we get to wargaming, the staff may have been up for 24 hours at some point. It's late at night. This is the last thing standing between them and publishing the plan. And it's the three will sit around with some staff if they're kind of doing it right, and they will mechanically go through a sync mat and try to align warfighting functions per the sync mat. But we're not really going into any kind of detail. So we're doing the process, but we're doing it really poorly.
Yeah, I think, in terms of the intellectual energy required to do it correctly, we may need to power down other portions of the MDMP to make sure we have the right energy for course of action analysis.
It's got to be deliberate.
It's got to be super deliberate. It's got to have rules to it as well. Doctrine tells us we need to do it. Doctrine tells us what the inputs, outputs, and participants are in a war game. And it tells us some methods that frame how we do it, but the detail of how we do it is not super described, right? You and I have discussed in previous forums, like, in order to be good at it, you have to do it. But more importantly, you have to create a system that's repeatable. So everybody is trained and comes to the table knowing the expectations of when we war game, what we're actually doing. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if you've got, I started looking at this problem in detail, I think probably last October, to try to be some sort of use, because the most of JRTC was doing an exercise in Hawaii. The Infantry Task Force seniors didn't have a role in that, so I'm like, I'm going to use this time to try to be useful and dig into it. My first position was, well, maybe there's a problem with Doctrine. So I started digging into Doctrine, and I reached out to some of the folks at Leavenworth. And as I continued to dig into it, I'm like, I don't know if there's a problem with Doctrine. I think the problem is, the challenge we may have is that Doctrine assumes relatively experienced staff. And what we see in reality is that the staffs don't have the experience through training or just execution to help identify those friction points. Using CASEVAC as an example, right? So we frequently won't think through, or we don't understand the effects of the battalion casualty collection point being behind, two creeks, and without a secure G-lock, and how we evacuate casualties to that point. And by the way, we didn't forecast that we're actually going to take about a company's worth of casualties. We forecasted a squad. So what does that actually mean in time and space? What does that do to operational tempo? But we're not synchronizing the other warfighting functions. We're decent with maneuver and fires, but we really struggle when it comes to anything with the sustainment enterprise in particular on the backside, and then we're surprised. So there's a big experiential gap.
And part of that's because we may plan it, right? And we may go through the planning process, we don't execute it.
Right.
So we don't learn the physical, visceral outcomes of what that means. We don't actually consider all the facts and the details, right?
Right.
It's like you don't feel that 40-person mass cal CASEVAC. You don't have a company commander standing in front of you, and you've seen that formation depleted, and you see the outcomes of poor staff planning resulted in this traumatic situation. We as humans learn through repetition and trauma, and when we don't have an opportunity for that trauma, we don't necessarily learn the right lessons, and we kind of skate through it.
And MDMP builds on itself, right? So if we don't do good mission analysis where the entire staff weighs in and helps the two figure out by warfighting function what the enemy's capabilities are and what those courses of action could be for the enemy. So we don't have a good enemy picture. Then as we go into course of action development, I've seen situations where the two will be like, oh, hey, I forgot to put in this obstacle belt. And they'll start adding things during course of action development as they've thought about the problem set more, because potentially they didn't get enough help or they didn't put enough thought into it during mission analysis. And then the courses of action change. That bleeds away at time for the war game. So we're wargaming in stride sometimes while we're doing course of action development. But again, that's not bringing the entire staff together. That'll frequently be like the 2 and the 3 and the FSO. And then we tell the sustainment enterprise to figure it out on the backside when we don't understand the operational costs to what we're doing, because every operation's got a cost, right, when it comes to equipment and commodities and soldiers.
Yep.
And we don't clearly articulate that. We focus on seizing an objective or what the end state we want to achieve is, but we don't clearly define how we get there sometimes. And also with the going back to the doctrine piece, I have a tendency to go on tangents, but going back to the doctrine piece, I think the doctrine is sufficient, but again, assuming a practiced staff. Call has published some documents about wargaming, and what really made me think about how do we develop a rules-based wargaming system, and whether that's something at the unit level potentially. But some of the recommendations that Call had, hey, get your staff thinking about these things by executing either simulations-based wargaming. So there's a difference between course of action analysis and wargaming that we do as part of a staff, but then getting through the execution kind of with wargaming or using tabletop games like Risk and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think one of the big keys and what we keep getting back to is that the training's got to happen before you have to do it under canvas, or you just don't have the sufficient depth of experience to understand and identify where those friction points are going to be.
Yeah, I think about, we're an action-oriented organization as the Army, right? We're knocking down targets as they come up, trying to get to the next thing. Most leaders have a pretty significant bias for action, and that causes us to make assumptions and make decisions sometimes that aren't super well informed, because we have a high risk tolerance, and I think as an Army we do a pretty good job of evaluating risk that we know about, right?
Yes.
It's the unidentified risks that you can pull out through like a war game that we're not so great about thinking through. And part of it's because I don't believe we do a good job teaching folks how to think, right? Nobody grades you as a AS3 on how well you sit there and pontificate and tear apart a problem, because that 3 just wants you to get to the next target, man. You are propping me up right now, solve that problem to a 70 percentile solution, let's go to the next thing. But there's some really developmental critical thinking that can occur and has to occur for us to really optimize a process. And that bias of action kind of causes us sometimes to miss opportunities to really develop critical thinking.
Well, we've got to be exposed to different scenarios as well. And again, that's a huge advantage we have being at a CTC. You see these things every month and you see them over and over again. So you're learning constantly.
It's a reason you should come here and work here, right?
Right, yeah. AIM Marketplace, based on when we're recording this, it's still open for about 2 more weeks if anybody wants to come. We've got a couple slots left. But that experience level, because the critical thinking is important, but you've got to understand the framework that you're operating in. And one of our senior mentors at MCTP, he asked our group of OCs one time what the most important part of a puzzle is. And one of our officers, quick thinking, he's like, "Oh, sir, I've got it. It's the corners." And the senior mentor was frustrated. He's like, No, it's the box top, because if you can't see the box top, he's like, that's what the commander provides, is the box top. That's the
visualization.
Picture. Yeah, the visualization. That's the picture you're trying to create, right? And you've got to be exposed to those things, understand what the contingencies are, and a lot of that's experiential, but how do we develop that? Because we're going from conceptual planning to highly detailed planning through the wargaming and identifying where those friction points are, so that we can synchronize and mitigate or take advantage of and exploit opportunities that we may have, or identify where we are vulnerable as well. But a lot of that comes with experience, and we can train for it, but we've got to expose people to it, and a lot of that's through execution.
Yeah, I think it has to be done on tactical problem sets too,
Yes.
right? Because it doesn't scale from the battalion ball to,
No.
moving to contact. It's not the same problems. The variables we're having to consider are different, and the potential risk outcomes are much different as well. But the one superpower, super tool we have in our formations is we've got commanders who have a lot of experience, right?
Yes.
Who have the most experience in that formation. We have non-commissioned officers who know the right questions to ask to expose vulnerabilities. They can smell something that's not truthful a mile away and ask it in a manner that exposes errors in our thinking or things we've assumed, which goes back to the focus on the commander's role in the war game. You talked about visualization, right? So it goes back to the start. How are we providing commander's planning guidance in a way that makes sense to all of my staff? If you're a battalion commander, your staff is like whoever's left, and they don't have reps. Some of them are brand new to the Army, so being able to articulate your thoughts and your critical considerations in a manner that a relatively inexperienced Army person can understand is crucial.
Yeah.
The box top, right? Like, what is this thing supposed to look like at the end? Everybody has to understand that. And then that commander's role in MDMP in the war game is like there to keep the process grounded to the expected outcome and end state, making sure we don't lose track of the visualization, and then providing that experience to say, hey, what you just said is factually incorrect because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
You're not a bad human, you just don't know because you don't have the experience to make those assessments. And I'll be honest with the crowd here, as a battalion commander, I kind of failed in this area because I had one extremely gifted field grade. He'd been an OCT. He knew all the tricks of the trade and the doctrine, and it kind of became a crutch for me, right? Because I could provide my commander's influence in areas I wanted to, but man, the war game wasn't always it, right?
Yeah.
And then I left my poor XO, who was dog-tired smoked, to do the best he could in an environment where I set him up for failure. He needed another set of eyes over his shoulder to say, you're fantastic, but you forgot about this because you haven't slept in 3 days. And shame on me for that. Lesson learned, right? I won't do it again. But we make false assumptions about the capabilities and experience of our staffs. And really, until you get to the brigade level, do you have folks that have had enough experience to be dangerous? Like, they've probably got a 70% solution for most of it, but still requires that commander's oversight and influence and feedback to keep it on the rails.
Yeah, and that having, and I don't think I did anything great as a commander necessarily. And I'm not setting this up as a humble brag because it's not. But when I was at MCTP, I got to see some of the challenges with wargaming and not fully understanding those until I'd done a couple repetitions. And I'm like, okay, I think I've got a much better understanding of wargaming. Even though I'd been a Squadron 3 and a Brigade 3, I had a much better understanding of it, why it's important, because we're carrying it through execution now, and I can see where those gaps are, right? So when we would do planning events with the staff, being able to sit there and I'm like, I'm gonna have a light touch in wargaming initially, and then I start hearing some of the assessments from my staff, and my S01 was using a calculator. He was awesome, using a calculator that was provided by his branch, and our casualty estimates were so low that we started reverting to hey, let's use the Leavenworth COFMS calculator, right? Because and those COFMS typically play out here as well. And hey, I don't think we're going to take 1 or 2 casualties in this engagement. I think we're probably going to take about 30% casualties in this engagement. And this is what it looks like. And then trying to synchronize other warfighting functions behind that. Because the commanders usually weigh in pretty heavily on the synchronization of maneuver and fires. And then we sort of disregard anything that happens after we seize the objective.
Right.
And that's where a lot of the friction is, where you have a lot of challenges with tempo. And an example from my time in command, and where I'm going with this is the sergeant majors can make a huge difference when it comes to wargaming, and they should be, or at least the senior NCO should be integrated to the greatest extent possible, looking for those gaps the officers are not catching. And what I'll frequently say to folks coming here is, how many officers here have carried a litter with a casualty outside of PT hours? And it's very few.
Yeah, crickets.
But a lot of our NCOs have, either in training or in actual combat. An example from when I was a commander was about 18 months ago. We were downrange and we had to do something that might have gotten pretty sticky pretty quickly, and we're doing a quick commander and staff war game on how we'd execute. And one of the troop commanders had a great plan, found a great place to establish a support by fire, and the sergeant major was able to come over the top and be like, hey sir, how are we going to get a casualty off of that roof?
Yeah.
There's no way we can get a casualty off of there. And if we don't have somebody with the experience that's done that can look at those problems, then we scale it up to, hey, we're going to lose a whole company in this operation. How are we evacing a company worth of KIA or WIA in a timely manner? Because it's going to affect tempo, it's going to affect a lot of things. How do we do that? And the officers don't have the experience, so that's where the Meadow's a great American, but he or she doesn't have the experience. Yeah. The medical platoon sergeant has some of that, but they're busy with their platoon as well. So how do
it's hard for them to understand the scale. Yeah,
we got to bring that in so we can understand the entire breadth and depth of the operation.
The best sergeant major question I heard asked during a war game was, hey sir, we can do that, but right, and explaining the cost. It's a transition of resources, time, people's lives. Class 5, class 3. Almost anything's achievable, but at what cost, and like what do you look like on the backside of that? And I think that's where we fail, because we don't actually go through the step drill by the warfighting functions of identifying, not just actions on the objective, what that looks like, but for the transition process of refueling, rearming, reorienting, right? Like, how does that play into it? Are we actually thinking beyond the objective in terms of what we look like and how we transition to the next mission? Yeah,
or you'll see frequently in a car, for example, an organization may fight through a couple objectives before they get their final objective, but we are not clearly articulating, hey, sir, I'm going to have to do a pause for about 60 minutes after this objective to then replenish class 1. I'm out of class 5 AT ammunition. I'm going to have to evac casualties because I'm forecasting I'm going to lose about 2 squads during this engagement before I go to the next thing. And then how does that affect tempo on the backside? We're just frequently like catastrophic success, I can achieve my objective. And then when we have to do it in execution, we're surprised, like, hey, we got stopped cold at the second objective because we culminated.
Yeah.
Because we didn't forecast how much ammunition it would take, how many soldiers it would take, how much equipment we would lose while doing this. And then it desyncs the entire operation because we didn't get into that detailed planning through wargaming and discussion.
And it's our strengths as an Army that get us to that point, right? Like, we are a bias for action, success-oriented organization.
Very optimistic.
We're high performers, optimistic, find the pony, we'll get there, right? And it takes a special kind of leader. I think a certain kind of leadership, experience level, and humility, and ability to tell the truth even when it's not super, what everybody wants to hear. And you see that in some of your field grades. Like, they'll get to the point they've seen enough to be like, hey sir, we need to ask a question here, because like the thing you were just briefed is not going to come out looking as shiny as it was just explained, right? Mm-hmm. They can reorient the formation to dig into the details there. But you mentioned a couple things I'm going to get into. Cars often become war games because it didn't war game.
Yep.
And we bluff our way through it because we got to be successful in front of the audience, right? We don't want to get into the details, exposes the lack of a good plan. So a certain amount of staff humility has got to be there. Like, we're not perfect.
Yeah.
And living in a world where your subordinate formations are there to help expose gaps and fix them, not be a problem identifier, but a problem solver. Hey, we totally hand-waved this. This is a critical vulnerability. Staff messed up on it. I'm not throwing stones, but we've got to figure out a solution together as a team to solve that. Building that attitude in a formation to where everybody understands that they own a part of the solution, right? And we're not afraid to raise our hand and not call out somebody, embarrass them, but identify critical vulnerabilities that at the end of the day get people killed, right?
We've all got to pay that bill at the end of the day, across the entire formation.
That's right. And I think that's why commanders are so important in the process, right? Because if you look at one person that has the highest relative chance of being able to identify those things, it's that person, not because they're great, but because they have experience and reps. And if they're not part of that process, then we are buying risk we don't understand. We talk about risk in terms of like known knowns, known unknowns, and then the big scary ones, the unknown unknowns. And we don't have leaders on top of things with experience to at least be able to identify the smell of those problems and say, hey, like, we don't know what this is, but I can account for it as risk because I know something's there. It takes a relatively, level of experience that most folks don't have to be able to know how to articulate that and then how to mitigate it, right? We can't ask a second lieutenant S4 to do that. Yeah. It's unfair to them. It's unfair to the organization. And that's why, being a commander, being a leader, being a field grade, like, there's a cost to that, and it requires energy, and it requires, being involved and being present. that comes with the parking space, right? Like you've got to do it, and nobody else can solve that problem.
Yeah, and the field grades are always going to try to make it happen regardless, right? Because they're not in the no business. Nobody in the Army's in the no business. We're in the yes but business. But the commanders they're the only ones that have got the experience, and they've got the authority to be able to go to their commander and have a commander's dialogue and be like, hey, sir, here's a challenge that I don't think we can overcome. We may have to adjust this. That the field grades, they can work some of that at their level, but it's not going to get to the commanders. Frequently, problems don't get to the commanders because the field grades, I think, just try to make it happen.
Yeah, I think we've got to be more mature in how we express those problems in a way that's not, it can't be want, we got a problem here,
It's
and
not
everybody,
whinging.
right, and everybody turns inward and sulks about it, but it's, we build a culture where identifying unknown problems becomes rewarded because we save lives by doing it, right? And we're putting the intellectual capital towards solving those problems.
And calling out things that don't make sense. When you have a formation that'll brief, like, or the Fires Enterprise, as an example, I'm not picking on fires, but so I've got 15 destruction missions. That is a meaningless metric.
Yeah.
Because it's like, with what systems, against what type of enemy, it engaged in what activity. That is a meaningless metric because your round allocation is going to be completely different. You're trying to engage a platoon of T-90s that's dug in versus an infantry platoon that's in the open.
That's right.
And what system you're using to engage.
That's right.
So we've got to get into the details.
That's right. So we've identified some of the struggles of wargaming and some of the, I'll call it, cultural issues and formations of the lack of interest in spending the time and capital towards developing really critical thinkers in the process, right? And understand the process. So the question becomes, like, how do we fix it? And you've written a pretty good paper on how to kind of break these problems down, and you offer a couple of recommended fixes. And the first one you talk about is, our staff has to understand why the war game is important and what it does for the command.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So, because we talked about, like, where wargaming is in the process, right?
Yep.
It's after co-development, and frequently units are like, hey, I've got a directed course of action. There is no co-comparison that needs to occur. It's like, no, there still is. You still need to do co-comparison wargaming by, let's kind of fight the plans or talk through them at least so we can understand the gaps.
Let me pause you for a second, because directed course of actions is where I see many brigades just go completely off the rails, and we end up with we ordered fish, we got chicken, and we don't understand why at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Commanders influence staffs to provide directed course of actions because we hear the commander articulate his visualization of what he wants, and that looks like a certain thing, and all of our confirmation bias starts playing in here, and we go, well, hey, what he described looks like this avenue of approach, this formation type, this type of movement. So we're going to build what he asked for, right? When we actually have to take a step back and say, what's the end state the commander's trying to achieve based on how he described and visualized it, and what are the different shades of gray in there that are, distinguishable from each other that can accomplish that same end state? I don't think any commander really, when they describe, like, this is what I want to have happen, expects the staff to just turn off all the intellectual machinery and go, hey, make the ham sandwich, man. That's what he asked for.
Yeah.
We've got to be better than that. But we sometimes lull ourselves into this false sense of, well, he's a commander, he or she's a commander, they have the most experience, they asked for that, so we're going to give it to them, and that's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing as a staff.
Yeah.
It's a huge vulnerability that we see all the time.
Yeah, without going back to the commander, without bringing the commander in, because there's a tendency with staffs frequently to try to keep the commander a little bit at arm's length because, hey, I've got this, I understand, I'm a great American, I'm going to make this thing happen for the boss and for the formation. But again, they don't murder board it, and I think a big deficiency, we spend a lot of time synchronizing the blue plan without really incorporating the enemy plan. And what are the enemy's branches? What are the enemy's sequels? What are the different courses of action the enemy is going to take based on our actions? Because they're not going to sit there static and allow us to impose our will and just continuously kill them until we achieve catastrophic success.
And this is how you develop your S2s, right? Yeah. Like, this is where they have to stand there and articulate the event temp. They have to be able to brief the operation as a red commander, describe decision points and how those are tied to what we're collecting on and the NAIs we're observing. And if we can't do that, then our base problem is probably wrong because we don't understand the enemy.
Yeah.
And hey, spoiler alert for all the junior leaders out there, like, commanders don't know everything. Like, just because you have a commander behind your title doesn't mean that you know all the answers. The art of it is becoming a subordinate who can lead up by asking probing questions at the right time or providing recommendations that help sharpen your commander's thinking. Because as you get tired and as more things are on your plate, it's impossible to apply 100% of your focus on one thing. And you could be the smartest, most articulate person, you're going to start missing stuff. And that's why commanders have staffs. But we're often, some people are persnickety. Some people don't like to be told no. Some people don't like to be told, hey, great idea, but like it's not all rainbows and unicorns like you described. That is on us as field grade leaders, as junior officers, as NCOs, and learning the art form of leading up by saying, we can do this, but here's the cost associated with how you describe this. Hey, sir, I think we have failed to consider certain things that changes the outcome of what you're looking for, right?
Yeah.
In a way that we're not like pointing fingers, you're wrong because you're the guy or girl in charge, but as an organization, we've missed some things, and this is how we can fix it, right? And often, I get to observe a lot of leaders under load, and for all the commanders out there, how you react to that will set the course of action for how your staff responds to problems forever.
Yeah.
And we have to be humble and have to realize that, because the outcome will be totally derived from our personal interaction and our personalities and how we carry ourselves when the news isn't good.
Yeah. And, I think we've got to be flexible, too. And not flexible to the point of, like, bending into chaos.
Yeah.
But there's also a tendency, and I've seen this multiple times, where the two will develop courses of action, and then as we start developing the blue courses of action, or potentially get into wargaming, the two starts making adjustments, and the rest of the staff is infuriated. But the two is understanding things more now as, we're making adjustments.
Or the two's an insurgent and starts making adjustments to support the blue plan.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's even worse.
That happens too. I mean,
we just want to get this thing published.
We got to throw all the flags simultaneously when that happens, because we're just trying to get to the end, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you can go in either direction, and it's not good. But while MDMP is sequential, there's a little bit of bleed over, because your understanding is continuing well past mission analysis, and the enemy, their understanding is going to continue as your mission progresses as well.
You also talk about, who participates, and we talk about, we've said it 100 times here about the importance of the commander in the wargaming process, but you also focus on the necessity for the entire staff to be involved. And what I often see is, because when we build our planning timelines, these things happen at the most inopportune moments, when we're tired and everybody's not up to participate, or in the middle of a battle rhythm event with the higher headquarters. I get the assistant to somebody else, right? And it's unfair to them to engage in this dialogue, because they don't understand the problem the same way as probably that primary does or the NCOIC does. And like we're buying risk by doing that. Now, I think that goes to a couple things. One, like our battle rhythm's got to be made in a way that it is congruent with our planning timelines. We can't just double stack things, and especially when we look at our key leaders in a battalion and brigade, they can't be everywhere at once. So if we've got to spread the peanut butter, you've got to listen to what I'm ingesting and understand it from my perspective, so you can represent me when you go to that meeting, right? Or you go to this wargame event. But it also requires us to actually train on it, right? Like we've got to have experience doing it. And not just the primary person, but like the entire team. So when we have to start spreading ourselves across multiple equities, we have the knowledge of the processes there to keep us grounded. What are your thoughts on effective ways to train wargaming within our units?
So I think, again, going back to when I was trying to look at this problem, and I mentioned earlier, Carl had some recommendations about modeling and simulation, and then games like Risk. I was like, my 8-year-old daughter can play Risk, but that doesn't mean that she can war game effectively. We've literally got all the tools that we need to do it. We just need to assign some basic rules. And while that's probably not super effective under Canvas, I think what you need to do is you've got to train that beforehand, so then you can go through contingencies and war game as essentially use wargaming at home station during training as like a tabletop exercise. So you can go through your Plan X and then execute the mission through a tabletop exercise on 150,000 maps with some basic rules for, and it could vary based on your formation, right? But behaviors that you want to reinforce, whether that's incentivizing, conducting good reconnaissance, thinking through how you're executing sustainment and CASEVAC, how you're replenishing, class 5, class 1, class 3, whatever the commodity is, but working through what that tabletop exercise looks like to then help your staff understand where the friction points can be. So when you get to JRTC and your battalion does a dismount infiltration through the wood line and you don't have that G-lock, and then you take a company's worth of casualties on the objective, you're not at that moment trying to figure out how do I evac casualties, 100 plus casualties across 3 creeks, and 8 kilometers to the rear before I can get to wheeled mounted assets. In a lot of cases, particularly with light infantry now, as we're trying to disperse more based on things that we're seeing, some of the conflicts elsewhere in the world that we've got to disperse. We're using the wood lines a lot more, the roads less. And how do we assign combat power to mitigate that, right? And so historically, in a lot of infantry fights, we've got 25 to 30% of a formation is frequently assigned to conduct sustainment operations, and that could be an entire infantry company in a battalion is conducting sustainment operations, conducting casualty evacuation, and that changes our COFMs. That changes how we employ our formation.
Change our risk tolerance.
Yeah, it changes a lot of things. Yeah. It increases endurance in some ways, reduces combat power in other ways, but it allows us some flexibility, because again, when we get back to that's an FSC problem. Well, is that an FSC problem? The FSC doesn't have the capability to do that unless we secure a G-lock for them to do that.
That's right.
They optimize to do this in this environment.
And what are the problems they already have that now we're adding problems they don't even know they're assuming, right?
Right.
You said something a second ago, but the process of training wargaming is really training critical thinking.
Yeah.
And Doctrine provides us a foundation of how to do it, but it doesn't constrain us to an only way, right? And what my thoughts are is that we've got leaders in our formation who have really different outlooks on potential solutions to a problem, right? And you can use wargaming as a format methodology to help people learn how to think. I go back to an example. I was the NTC as a battalion commander, and General Garrett was the Force Comm commander, and he came out, and just to my luck, he shows up in the middle of war game for us, right? And he comes in, he checks out what's going on, asks questions to the leaders, and tank commander, what's going on? I was like, hey sir, we're about to do the war game for this next operation. And he's like, well, that's interesting, because I'm a pretty good war gamer. Mind if I sit in and participate in this? And I'm like, yeah, I know what the answer is. Yes sir, sure, sit down. And I learned so much in a period of time. One, our plan was exposed, it was totally awful. I appreciated that. It was fair. But the questions he asked, based on 37 years of experience, right? And the not just if X then Y, but the second and third order effects of that, and how he tied it back into the staff process.
Yep.
Do you understand that because you don't understand the enemy and you just expended a whole bunch more class 5 than you anticipated, we've caused a BSB problem now?
Yep.
So now, battalion commander, how are you going to help your brigade solve that problem without creating a problem that the brigade cannot solve, right? So I took my whipping and walked out of it with wow, there's levels to this, and we're not as good as we think we are. But what I saw with my junior leaders was oh, it's unconstrained. I can tease this out as far as I can go with it, and it's really, I think, at the battalion level about trying to figure out where you're causing brigade and higher problems, right? Where we're committing the brigade to something that's not part of the plan.
Yeah.
Especially sustainment ops, but they weren't just going action, reaction, counteraction. We were teasing out things that none of us had thought about, that if I was a brigade commander, I'd be like, holy crap, that's a big problem. Don't do that for me, right?
And that's where, and that's the one thing, potentially the only issue I would take with some of our doctrine is the action, reaction, counteraction, because that does feel constraining.
Yep.
Versus sort of a more free-flowing, turns-based, based on we assess who may have the initiative, when are we executing fires, when are we executing these things, and so breaking it down into turns. For training in particular, action, reaction, counteraction, if you've got a trained staff under canvas, you could probably execute that effectively. I've always had challenges with that personally.
I think too, we just got to train our people to understand that, hey, the rules are here, so when you're tired and hungry, we don't miss things, right? but you're not constrained to how wide and broad you can think and how critical we can be. Don't take this as a reason to be intellectually lazy. This just keeps us on the road. This is the markers on the highway that keep us going in the right direction without hitting somebody head on, right?
Yep.
And, empowering them to explore the space and use their minds critically to help solve problems for the units at Echelon. You talk about some of the outcomes of, if we train warfighting effectively, what does it do for us as an Army? And, you talk about in your paper everything from it gives our staffs a better understanding of the importance of their warfighting function and, more importantly, the interrelation of the warfighting functions. In your experience, how have you seen that kind of manifest itself through wargaming?
So the way that can work out through wargaming, again, is if we've got, and I'll use, because I do a lot more sustainment stuff right now with the Lima team and talking to sustainers as they come through here. But if our sustainers, and I've worked with some great sustainers too as a field grade, if they're embedded in as part of the planning process, and then as we get into wargaming, we're forecasting, we understand what the cost is. Because a lot of times the maneuverists, they'll think cost in term of I'm losing combat power equals soldiers.
Yep.
And we've got big blue arrows. But the sustainers will be able to think through, okay, where do we need to conduct an LRP? What is the consumption rate of this infantry battalion that is moving dismounted in 100-degree heat through the wood line? Maybe it's a quarter an hour on water. That means that we've got to do an LRP here. We've got to do a pause for sustainment. Then as we get through this, with the maneuverists, if the maneuverists are thinking about this too, then this enemy objective has a platoon of BMPs. We'll forecast 2 by AT systems per each one of those, which will put us down X number of AT rounds and AT systems. Then we can forecast the number of casualties that'll take. Then what does that look like? And we can use the Leavenworth COFMS calculators as well to understand what the backside of the objective looks like. That, okay, we're going to lose an infantry company in this attack, or we're going to lose a battalion in this attack, probably concentrated in these areas. How do we get them out of there and then get replenishment forward, conduct a hasty defense, rapidly reconstitute to try to maintain tempo? So if we do that in wargaming, we can talk through that level of detail because the staff understands the plan well enough and where we're going, where they can help with the forecast those transitions and prevent culmination, looking at sustainment.
Yeah.
Then we can be really effective and we'll have a plan that has some endurance to it versus we'll sprint until we seize the objective, then eventually have to give that ground back to the enemy because we can't hold it because we don't have the sustainment pushing us to continue to maintain tempo. I
think that's where we lose, right? And my perspective is watching the brigade staff and brigade commanders and kind of how they formulate decisions and plans. And what I see is when we don't war game, because most of the time we're not going to uncover in our war game that our operational construct leads to failure. Like we've usually got a solid enough plan to we're going to complete the mission on the objective, right?
Big blue arrows are good.
Big blue arrows. There's less red than blue at the end of this. We own the key terrain and we've taken an objective. But what we don't understand unless we do thorough wargaming is how we look afterwards. You described that as in tempo and transitions. And I think from a brigade perspective, that is maybe perhaps the most important part of the war game is that I fully understand what I look like across all warfighting functions at the end so I can assess how rapidly I can transition to my next operation and then what are the costs during that period of time, right? Am I moving batteries between PAAs to increase my operational reach with fires? Am I having to sustain an entire brigade simultaneously, which slows down my ability to transition to some other form of maneuver?
Or C2, where are you in your pace?
That's right. Or can I even talk with folks at this point in time?
When do I have to transition between one command post to the next based on comms ranges, or I've got to adjust my pace? Because at this point on the offense, we can't talk to the front line anymore. So how do I adjust? And how do I mitigate that so we don't have this stutter step in communications and command and control?
That's right. And that is clearly illuminates why all the warfighting function pros have to be there because, like leaving the S6 out of that conversation, and all of a sudden you figure out none of your comms networks work.
Yep.
You're out of position with retrans. Everything falls apart because if we can't talk, we can't fight. But it's one critical thing missing the process because we're not thorough and not disciplined. It rickrolls the entire plan, right?
Yep.
I think the other piece that wargaming allows us to do is to identify branches and sequels.
Yeah.
And that quite frankly gets hand waved here a lot. We don't have enough of an understanding of the primary course of action to understand what potential deviations in either the enemy's activities or our success leads to a branch plan, or we have an opportunity based on success or an enemy vulnerability we didn't see that allows us to conduct a sequel operation, a follow-on, if you will, because we've not gotten to the depth of details, right?
Yeah.
I think it's another critical area because we're looking at before, at, and beyond our objectives when we plan. If we don't know the details and the second and third order actions of what we're actually doing, we'll never identify these opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And then we can't do RDSP because if you don't have a plan, you can't do RDSP, complete COA, right? If you don't identify branches and sequels, then we can't make adjustment decisions between the two. We're just making stuff up. This is the process of MDMP. This is the part of MDMP where we allow ourselves that flexibility to have other plays in our playbook because we've actually developed them out enough to see it.
Yeah. And at a minimum, at least getting some thorough and deliberate planning priorities for the reserve by phase of the operation.
Yeah.
As well. Because frequently we're going to take a swag guess. They're going to go in the north, they're going to go in the south. They've got 2 planning priorities. But there's a lot more, that's the minimum that wargaming should be able to give us maneuver-wise is like, hey, some good, reasoned, thought-out, deliberate planning priorities for our reserve. And then, like you were saying, branches and sequels. But again, we've got to understand the enemy's capabilities and kind of be able to fight those things out and understand what we actually look like and how the enemy's going to fight and try to affect us. All
right, so we've talked about a lot. And we've talked about the process, talked about kind of the need for a rules-based system. We've talked about the critical importance of developing thinkers in our formations. Yeah. That and then we do it at a time period where people are optimized to provide their best feedback. I kind of want to come back and review a couple of key tenets of what we've talked about. The commander is central to the process. We as commanders cannot hand wave our importance to the process or our responsibility to the process. We got to be there. We got to be driving it, and we've got to provide that experience level with us and our sergeant majors to make sure we don't allow the staff to make mistakes that they, quite frankly, don't know they're making. The second piece, and it's tied to the first, is that commanders can't live in a post-staff world, right?
Yeah.
I think that's how you phrased it. You spend 18 years to become a battalion commander because you no longer want to be a staff officer, and then you realize one day, I have to be the ultimate staff officer to teach these folks what has to happen.
It's depressing.
It's depressing. Yeah. It's a huge culture shock because you didn't realize that. And that I personally struggle with that as a battalion commander. I found myself teaching things that I thought as a commander would just come to me because I had people to do that.
Yeah.
And
because you remembered how great you were at the end of your KD time.
Right. The last 2 months when you finally got it all together, you remember how that looked like, and we forget how much we struggled early on. Yep. We also uncover these knowledge gaps in our staffs, and we get frustrated with it, right? And we realize that, hey, I can either accept the fact we'll never get good at this, or I can invest the time and teach the folks what right looks like, really teach my field grades, so I've got multiple instructors to discipline the process. And then that frustration goes away because we're no longer starting over with people and, wading through what they don't know.
Yeah, we've got to invest in the staff to extend influence as commanders, because commander to commander is great, but you can't sustain that for a long duration. That's like a corrective more than anything in a lot of cases, I would say, because the staff has still got to be able to back it up to give you that endurance.
Right. And then we discussed, Doctrine provides a way, but it doesn't provide the way. Yeah. It gives us a kind of a frame-based approach to how we do this. But within your unit, you've got to define the rules of the game. So when we're tired, hungry, and haven't slept, and we're focused on 10 things, we're anchored to a process that gets us to an acceptable outcome, right? And if we don't invest the time in describing that and putting it on paper, and more importantly, doing it to where it becomes something that's ingrained in our culture as a staff and a formation, and not just an afterthought of something we're forced to do because it's this step on MDMP, it gives us some grounding to fall back on when we're not in our best position. And then I think the last piece is really, we've got to take every opportunity we can to execute the process and do it, so that the first time we do it's not in contact, whether it be at a CTC or God forbid in some other country fighting for a flag. just as important as making sure our squad leaders and our soldiers understand their battle drills and how to use their weapon systems and be as lethal as possible, like arming the staff with this capability is just as important to preserving life. And we've got to have that existential drive to make sure that, not only do we understand as commanders, but our staff's understanding, they're wanting those reps to make sure that they can do the best job possible. So when they publish that plan, the poor guy that has to execute it has the most high probability of success of like walking away from it.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. The investment in the staffs, because we will typically give all of our love to the platoons and the companies and our squads.
The fun stuff, yeah.
Yeah, the fun stuff, the stuff that was fun, that we enjoyed, that we did very well, and we'll invest less in the staff because they do staff stuff. The 3 in the XO, they can worry about that. I've spent 18 years to become a commander. I'm doing this thing, but the staff really needs the attention. And then how do we train them? And it's not just through plan X's, right? Because that gets you through the plan, but we've got to then take it through execution.
Right.
And it details rules-based execution to build them that experiential understanding so they can identify those friction points. And then when you get under canvas, you can abbreviate the rules and make it much easier. And then maybe if we've trained them sufficiently and we know that we're getting good outputs, then we can go, Captain Wargan with the companies and the platoons, and spend a lot more time doing battlefield circulation and engaging junior leaders. But if the staff is struggling, then the whole formation is going to struggle regardless of the amount of effort we put on the front line.
100%. And I want to kind of come back to, I want to leave us with 2 points here before I turn it over to you for your final thoughts. But recent developments in Doctrine has injected a phrase into the wargaming process. I just want to talk about it for a second.
Yeah.
It's the idea of a commander's wargame. Not new. We often see the combined arms rehearsal become a commander's wargame because the first time we've actually rehearsed in the plan and we start exposing gaps in our knowledge or gaps in assumptions or gaps in the plan, and in commanders, because we're all co-located, we're just going to solve that problem because we're problem solvers, right? And we change a plan. So it kind of existed always. But Doctrine introduces the idea of a commander's wargame and being an acceptable function for the overall wargame of MDMP. And people much smarter than me have identified that as a way. But it's got to be rule-based as well. And it's got to be tied. The most important part is the subject matter experts for the warfighting functions have to be a part of that. When commanders get together, we have a tendency to create confirmation bias. Everybody wants to be successful, and we usually solve the most obvious problems, but it's those second and third order effects that we didn't account for because we're in a hurry, we've got stuff to do, we're wasting the boss's time, we've got to cross LD, we miss those things. Having field grades there to catch the details of what we're saying as commanders and to understand what that means in terms of second and third order effects, and then resynchronize the plan, right? I've never seen a sync mat at a commander's war game where we're actually capturing changes, which then influences an update to the X mat and fighting products.
Yeah.
So we actually have the plan. It's usually some changes are made and all the majors walk away going, oh man, did you hear what just happened? Like I don't have the stuff for that. We've got to go back.
We've all got different notes.
Right. We got different notes. We got to resync what we think we heard. They've all gone separate ways. It creates some confusion. So just a warning in terms of what I've seen, and we've taken that approach. It can be successful. You do have the potential to have the most experienced personnel reviewing the plan and making adjustments, but we have to have the architecture to support it, the right subject matter experts by warfighting function, the right field grades, to where we can take those kind of commander-described changes to a plan, resynchronize them, and get them out to the force in an executable manner.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
No, I think having the commanders highly involved, you're going to get great outputs. But again, it is how do we police that stuff up and then publish it so there is something that the staffs across the formation understand is, okay, here's exactly what we're doing. So that order is what's going to synchronize the battalions. The commanders can do a lot of that. It's easier, I think, to synchronize the maneuver battalions together. And the folks that really need a little bit more of that publication, that's going to be your enabling battalion. So your fires battalion, your engineer folks, your sustainers, because we're talking, asset emplacement to enable the maneuver force.
Yep.
And that takes time, and that takes a lot of deliberation.
Finite time, right?
Yep. Yeah, you've got to get class 5. You got to know where the guns are going to be at what point based on where the maneuver force is. Then you've got to position sustainment assets to continue to replenish those guns. Then understand where your casualties are going to be. So there's a lot of you got to synchronize on the backside, and the staff has got to be able to track it ultimately. Because if that information only resides with the commanders and you lose a command post or the commanders in their TAC and they're gone, then you've lost a lot of the knowledge on execution.
Right. I think there's a similar concern for battlefield circulation that takes place. We coach heavily here that when a commander goes on battlefield circulation, take the right people with you.
Yep.
And somebody's taking notes, and those notes are getting pushed back through whatever C2 conduit you have available at your fingertips to the staffs. So we level the bubbles on what has changed, what guidance has been given, and then the staffs can go back and synchronize the plan based on new information, right?
It's deliberate.
It's a deliberate, it's a continuous process. And it's got to be something that, good commanders do good BFC. They ask good questions. They've got a disciplined way they interact with subordinate commanders. And then they know that that's going to influence what my staff's doing wherever they're at, right? But if we approach it in a disciplined manner, we're not having a commander expectation that, well, hey, you heard me say that.
Yeah.
Why did it not happen? We got to set some guardrails for our staff so they can be successful in supporting that process.
Yeah.
And then finally here, my final kind of point before I turn it back over to you. We commonly say in coach, like 10 reps of MDMP makes you dangerous to where you actually know the process and you have a foundational understanding of it to where you can be successful. Every brigade in the Army is challenged with a pretty wild training path. There's a lot of requirements and not a lot of time. I would offer to everybody, we have the Brigade Command and Control Toolkit on Teams. Many of you have joined the team there, and what it allows for is a collection of best practices from across the Army, from across different types of formations. So you're not learning something from zero, right? Like people have gone and suffered through these problems, and we've tried to collect what we've seen as best practices and put them in one spot. And one thing in there that applies for this conversation is a doc temp for how to train your staff. It goes over a 12-month training cycle, and it talks about the collective training requirements from individual staff certification through battalion FTX, with all the Plan X's and CPX's in there to train across the warfighting functions on the different systems. So when you actually go to war or to a CTC, you've got the reps and sets to be survivable, right? But like some folks have already kind of figured out what a men force looks like there. I offer that to the force here. Take a look. It's not perfect, but it provides a framework for understanding the requirements to build a staff that's proficient enough to be dangerous. And then, through further repetition, you get good. But I just offer that as a resource out there. So, Ian, final comments to you. In terms of wargaming, what do you want our folks to walk away from this conversation taking?
Yeah, so I'd say for wargaming, again, we can't discount the importance of, COA comparison and wargaming, right, and co-analysis.
Yep.
We can't discount that. We've got to deliberately execute that MDMP, but we can't really do that effectively unless we've trained for it effectively at home station. And again, that's got to be rules based. And there's some rules that we developed in Task Force 1 that I've given to the FA-57 folks in the Glass House, and their professional simulators are going to take a look at and run some scenarios through and see how it works. But we've got to have a way through tabletop exercise to increase our experiential understanding across our staff, so that again, when we're under canvas, it's not the first time that the staff is seeing this.
Right.
That's like, hey, that's going to be a problem. They're identifying friction points and problems.
Anticipating.
Right, because they've war gamed it, or even better, if we can do it live in execution at home station, but it'll save you a lot of time under canvas, in contact, at JRTC or overseas someplace. So we've got to build that experience.
Yeah, and everything we do has got to be multi-echelon. We have to, every time we put somebody in the field, it's got to be how many echelons above them can we train to use this time as efficiently as possible. I think we miss out on opportunities a lot because we don't look at it that way.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Ian, I appreciate your time this morning. Very valuable conversation. And, for the greater audience, if you've got ideas that we didn't talk about, or if you've seen a way to do it that you think's better, or is a way that can make our Army better, please reach out, share with us, and we'll make sure that it gets across the force and people can learn from your experiences and your ideas.
Thank you for joining us on The Crucible, the JRTC Experience.
The Joint Readiness Training Center is the premier Crucible training experience. We prepare units to fight and win in the most complex environments against world-class opposing forces. We are America's leadership laboratory. Again, we'd like to thank our guests for participating. This podcast was created and produced by Mr. John Mabes. Executive producer is Lieutenant Colonel Drew Zabriskie. It was recorded by Captain Jermaine Branch and edited by Mr. Travis Boyle. Series intros were built by Chief Thomas Rich and vocals were done by Mr. Robert Chopper. Special thanks to Mr. Jeff England and the Fort Johnson Public Affairs Office. Be sure to like and follow us on social media to keep up with the latest warfighting TTPs learned through the Crucible that is the Joint Readiness Training Center. Follow us by going to https://linktr.ee/JRTC. We'd like to thank our partners at the Center for Army Lessons Learned of the Combined Arms Center, especially the JRTC Call Observations Detachment. Be sure to follow them on social media as well. Follow them at https://www.army.mil/CALL. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review us wherever you listen or watch your podcasts, and be sure to stay tuned for more in the near future. The Crucible, the JRTC Experience, is a product of the Joint Readiness Training Center.